You're listening to the Comedy Club on this station.
BBC Radio 4 Extra.
Prepare for your tiny mind to be truly blown.
Matthew, comedy and music. There wasn't much comedy on Radio 1 when you took over, was there?
There was a little bit of comedy when I took over. I mean, they'd done the Mary Whitehouse experience with David Baddiel and Rob Newman and various other luminaries, and I wanted to do more. I wanted to do more comedy. Because comedy seemed to be happening in a big way.
It was, of course, the new rock and roll.
Well, somebody said that, which obviously is nonsense, but in a way, it was the beginning of comedy going to big arenas. So for the first time, people were breaking out of small pubs and clubs, and
famously Baddiel and Newman,
which Radio 1 broadcast. We actually broadcast a show by Baddiel and Newman from Wembley Arena, which was an extraordinary event at that time. So it seemed like comedy was part of the, if you'll excuse the expression, the zeitgeist alongside the music.
Zeitgeist, you don't hear that word much anymore, do you?
and the challenge was, could they make comedy? Could the BBC Light Entertainment Department, could other producers make comedy that would sit happily on Radio 1?
Yeah, how would it be different on Radio 1? Perhaps a bit kind of groovier?
No, I wanted them genuinely to try to integrate music and into their programmes. And the prime exponent of that has always been Chris Morris.
Yes.
Chris Morris is somebody, because he comes from being a DJ. I mean, when I first worked with Chris Morris, he was on a radio station called GLR in London, where he was doing a 3-hour DJ show with comedy bits in it. So the music was very much a part of that. And he is an absolute enthusiast for music, a fan of music. So when he uses music, it becomes integral to the whole ambient sound of his comedy, most famously in Blue Jam.
Well, Blue Jam, as which was on Radio 1 when you were there, and it remains, it's sui generis, I'd say, wouldn't you?
If I understood what you meant, yes. Wonderful.
Does it mean a genre of its own?
It is on its own.
I may have mispronounced it.
Unique. No, I'm not very good at Latin. I had a very cheap education. But yeah, it is unique. And I think I call it ambient comedy.
Yes.
Because I think it sort of washes over you. And when I met Chris and I bumped into him in the street, actually, in Soho, and I said, "What are you working on?" And he said, "I'm working on something which is trying to convey what it's like, the kind of nightmares you have when you fall asleep listening to the World Service in the middle of the night." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. Let's have a listen." And I think he succeeded. And he insisted when it came to us that it should be broadcast in the early hours of the morning.
That's right.
Because that's
1 a.m., wasn't it?
Yes, because that's when he thought it was conceived to be heard. It was also helpful to us because it meant that we weren't getting in too much trouble because there won't be any children listening to it. And it was controversial and it was difficult. But he was the one who, head and shoulders above everybody else, managed to integrate music into the comedy. And I tried to throw that challenge out to other people to making those 9 o'clock comedies that used to go out on Radio 1. And they tried, but with varying degrees of success. It wasn't
which
natural.
ones were a success, would you say?
Well, I'm not sure any of them reached his heights.
No, there's nothing like that.
Because I think what the BBC Light Entertainment Department used to do was that they were used to making half-hour comedies for Radio 4. And so what they did was sort of create a half-hour comedy and then slot some music into it, which always sounded a bit false and a bit forced. Whereas with Morris, the whole thing was conceived as a unique whole.
You're listening to The Comedy Club on BBC Radio 4
BBC Radio
Extra.
4 Extra.
You're in for a treat.
A couple of the ones we've got Victor Lewis Smith. He actually rather fell out with Chris Morris.
There was a big feud between Victor Lewis Smith and Chris Morris.
I've got a bit of a feud with Victor too. I think he's got a few of them, probably.
It was the use of spooling tape sound effects that really sparked it off, and you can't imagine a more stupid thing for people to have a falling out about. But when Morris was working at GLR in London and Victor Lewis Smith was on Radio 4, Lewis Smith was accusing Morris of plagiarising this idea of spooling tape sound effects between the sketches. And I think he went so far as to daub graffiti on the outside of the GLR premises,
really?
Accusing Morris of this crime.
And Armando Iannucci,
and producer and presenter,
Yes.
And a lot of these people, I don't claim credit for their talent and I don't claim credit for discovering them because they were brought to me by, the BBC Light Entertainment radio department. And what I did was open the door. You know what I mean? I said, well, we like
But
you're
then you
doing,
had the
and
key
we'd
to
like
the
to put you
door,
on.
and-
Exactly. And
yeah.
I'd spend the money on you. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? I'm prepared to invest in this kind of program in a way that perhaps hasn't happened in the past. And so, I don't want to claim that I was in some way responsible for what they
Oh,
did,
go
because
on. Why not?
they did a great job themselves. You know what I mean? And they've gone on to greater things. But we offered them a platform. Is the
Yeah.
best I can say about it.
The Mary Whitehouse experience, was that one of yours?
No, that was before my time.
Yeah,
but we
then-
did have Newman and Baddiel.
Yeah, that's right. And the League Against Tedium, do you
Yes,
remember?
Simon Munnery, wasn't it?
Simon Munnery
Yes.
is an extraordinary comedian.
I love the surrealism. Do you know what I mean? I really love the surrealism.
Well, Munnery
of
is
it.
one of those comedians who's never stopped perverting, the genre in a way.
He seems like he wants to undermine the rules, and I was in the business of undermining the rules myself,
Even though in a way you're in the odd position of also being a big cheese at the BBC, though.
Well,
where-
I was hopeful that nobody had noticed, because we said about making these radical changes, and we wanted to subvert the very format of music radio, and allowing other people on who'd got this idea of doing surreal things with it was a joy to me. It gave me great pleasure to work with people who had these bizarre imaginations.
Yes, another one of the programmes we've been playing through this Radio 1 special week is Lee and Herring, and you introduced them onto Radio 1.
The Fist of Fun.
Yes.
And they were interesting because they were a great example of people who loved music and who tried to integrate the music into the show and were more successful than many in doing that. And so I felt that was a show that succeeded on the kind of terms that I was setting out. And again, it's gone on to be something of a cult listen for the next generation. And they also toured the country performing on behalf of Radio 1. And so there was a sense in which we were trying to send these signals about Radio 1's change and the kind of new talent that we were using. And they were part of spearheading that message out to the country.
Yes, and they're still, and they didn't even fall out too badly, I don't think. Normally,
Normally double acts fall out in a really terrible way, don't they? But I believe they're still quite polite to each other. But they've gone on to have such amazing comedy careers, and what's so satisfying from my point of view is, when I go up to the Edinburgh Fringe and there they are, and they're commanding large audiences, and their careers have thrived and prospered, as have many of the people who started out in the 90s on Radio 1.
It was a unique time marrying music and comedy seemed somehow.
But also, there's the classic variety show, Arthur, isn't there?
Yes,
there's the classic chat show on television where you would have a guest and then a band playing, or a song and then another guest, or more recently you'd have something like TFI Friday that Chris Evans used to do on Channel 4, where you'd have entertainment mixing with the bands, and I think, we were in that mould in a way. We were trying to recreate that sense that the young comedians of the era should be heard alongside the young musicians of the era.
Yes.
And then the two didn't necessarily have to meet, but I think there was a lot of mutual respect between some of them.
Oh, absolutely.
And the comedians were fans of the music, the musicians were fans of the comedy.
Well,
and so
yeah.
Radio 1, at that time, I was trying to emphasise Radio 1's difference from commercial radio. And it was an absolutely fantastic tool for saying only we would put the money into this, only we would support these people. And we were trying to show that we supported new talent. And why not show that we supported new comedy talent as well as supporting new musical talent?
I'm guessing you must have taken quite a lot of stick for it.
We took a lot of stick for a lot of things, actually. But, I mean, we were making radical changes to Radio 1, and there were a number of people who were upset. And then there was a sort of feeling that we put too much talking onto Radio 1. But talking, to me, provided it was entertaining talking, was part of the package. And these shows, these comedy shows, were definitely entertaining. And what's amazing to me is that we're sitting here talking about them 25 years later, and they've become a kind of cult thing.
Yes.
You meet people from my son's generation, and they talk to me about Fist of Fun and Blue Jam with awe, and
the
think how wonderful it
this
is.
programme, who's only a young woman, was listening to all that when she was about 12.
And I never knew at the time that they were going to survive in that way, but it's wonderful that they have. And so we created something that has survived and is now going to be heard on Radio 4 Extra.
You're listening to The Comedy Club.
The Comedy Club.
The Comedy Club.
The Comedy Club on BBC Radio 4 Extra.
Hooray!
Did you have to deal with the talent themselves, or did you? Or were you
Not
doing
very
it?
often. I mean, obviously, the one I had to deal with to my cost was Chris Morris. Partly because of our old relationship, our old working relationship, and partly because it was such a hot potato that I
Yeah.
thought I needed to take charge of it. And he had two stints on Radio 1. There was there was a live show which he did initially just called the Chris Morris Show, which we had to stop being live after he announced that Michael Heseltine had died. What he was doing was he was satirising the way in which people put together obituaries.
Yes.
And I'd specifically said to him about half an hour before he went on air, do not use the words Michael Heseltine has died. And then I went home and turned on the radio, and the first thing I heard was him using those very words.
You may have learned that, Matthew, that's a dangerous thing to say to a comedian.
The red rag to a bull.
Don't say
Exactly.
that. That means always that would be the first thing they are.
Well, he was a bit like that. I mean, because I think the Morris philosophy, it seems to me, is that he's on a crusade to undermine the hypocrisy of the modern media, including the medium that he's actually on at the time.
Yes.
And that you, as the management, represent, to a certain extent, the hypocrisy of the modern media.
Well, of
so
course,
if you can get
you
under your skin
to certain rules,
you have rules and regulations which he regards as censorship and jumped up and all the rest of it. So if he can get underneath your skin and upset you, then he's doing a very, very good job.
Well, in a way, that is appropriate to a station aimed at young people.
I agree. And I think there were those who thought that, the questions of taste and decency and what was acceptable in language terms and subject matter terms on Radio 1, were difficult areas to police.
Yes.
And I always had to have the edge, if you see what I mean. I saw them as being allowed to push against the edge as long as I was able to say, you've reached it now, and this far and no further.
You were the cliff.
And sometimes they went over it, and sometimes we upset people. But the people who complain are often people who weren't listening to Radio 1. The people who were complaining were those who felt they were policing Radio 1 on behalf of young people. And the young people, when we did the research about what was offensive to them, things they wouldn't like were racism, sexism, but some of the language that we used in these programs was absolutely fine. And the biggest sin, they said to us, was being boring. That came out number one as the most offensive thing you could do for a young listener.
Well, I think
we tried not to.
I think being boring is generally one of the most offensive things. If you're going to be boring, shut up.
Yeah.
You're quite unusual, Matthew, in as far as you're a presenter too, obviously. You do Radio 4, The Last Word, and Outlook on the World Service, and you always were. You started out as that. In fact, your ambition, I believe, was to be on Newsbeat.
Yes, well, I made it onto Newsbeat in the 1980s. Yeah, they let me on. I kind of knocked at the door for a long time, but eventually they let me on because I always used to think the Newsbeat was the height of my ambition because it was beautifully packaged. It was this attempt to tell stories to a young audience in a non-patronising way, but in a way that made the same sound as the pop music radio around it. And that's why I aspired to be on it. And it was great when I got to present it. But it was the same kind of aspiration I had about these comedy programmes, which was to try to make them fit into the seamless music package and jingles of Radio 1. And it was never perfect, I don't think, but I think we had a jolly good go at it.
Yeah, so if you ever get down on your luck, Matthew, fair enough, you should be able to go around with a cap.
You think so? I could be on the free fringe at least, couldn't I?
You ever thought of doing a comedy show yourself?
No, I don't think so. I don't think I could ever make anybody laugh.
Yeah, but you're used to sort of talking to people.
Yes.
You ever thought of doing it? People are terrified of doing stand-up.
Well, it does frighten me, I don't think I'd dare to compete with people like you, Arthur, because it's too scary. I like to sit in a studio with my headphones on, quietly on my own, talking seriously to people.
Well, what's the future of radio?
Oh, that's fascinating.
Got 5 seconds.
Well, you have to look in the direction of podcasting, Arthur, because 1,000 flowers are blooming out there and anyone can have a go.
That's right.
You're listening to The Comedy Club.
The Comedy Club.
The Comedy Club.
The Comedy Club on BBC Radio 4 Extra.
Hooray!